Welcome back to the World Networking Podcast. Today we have John Adrian, geoscientist, educator, and grad student joining us for the show. He's got a lot of cool information and experience in the scientific field, and he really wants to share that today. I returned from my journey and I got my computer back up and running, and we're editing away, so I am looking forward to returning everything back to pace. Hope you guys enjoyed the show today. Hi there, welcome to the World Networking Podcast. Today we have John Adrian joining us. John, what's something you'd like to share about your background?
First of all, hello, and thank you for having me. It's pretty interesting to do a podcast. It's my first one. I've never done that. So that's something about my background. I've never done a podcast. But no, seriously. I guess there's a variety of things, but I guess I can be a thrill seeker, but I'm also I'm addicted to the natural world and understanding how it works.
What's the aspect of the natural world that draws you in the most? Is it the landscape or the natural beauty of it?
All of that, but it's also, I don't know, my ADHD brain just for some reason loves to dig into systems and understand systems, and the way the earth works is the ultimate system to figure out, in my opinion. There's just so many.
Yeah, it's definitely a layered puzzle, at the very least, trying to discover what layers came first, what kind of forms. I'm sure it's puzzling to a lot of people that don't understand the science of it.
Well, even those that do, that's what we're doing, is essentially we're gathering the pieces of the puzzle and then putting them together on our papers.
Yeah, that's valid. Which school had the most inclusive environment for your studies?
Inclusive environment? Honestly,
Yeah.
I don't think I've been to a school that didn't feel inclusive. But I guess I was pretty lucky that way. I went to a pretty, I'm sure there was. I was also pretty self-absorbed for a lot of my younger years, as many people are. So maybe I didn't notice as much, but at least for what felt like to me. But you gotta remember, I'm a white male, so I can fit in most places fairly easily. But that being said, pretty much every school I went to, every college and university I've gone to so far, has really felt inclusive, but not only that, but active and energizing to me in my interests.
So you felt like overall it was healthy interacting with each of these school environments for your taste?
Yeah, absolutely. Each school brought new friends, new teachers, new interesting people to talk to and exchange ideas with. That's what college and university really is all about, is the exchange of ideas. And that's the place to do it. And so at these schools, at community college, it was more being introduced to the science and the sorts of techniques I might be using in the future, but a lot of it was basically just playing around in the desert or the forest, going on field trips and writing a few things in our notebook, but mostly just arm waving and go, "Ooh, look at that." But that was, it was an amazing experience for each of those field trips. There were a few major ones. Like each field trip was its own 1-unit class, essentially.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it was 5 days long.
So which of these field trips like drew you in the most?
Well, I've always been an explorer of the outdoors and the desert. So actually, Owens Valley and Death Valley, we went to Yosemite and then Owens Valley a little bit, like Mammoth Lakes area. And I had been through that region many, many times with my family because we used to take a road trip every summer from Southern California to Central Idaho because we have my family. Anyway, we know people up there. But yeah, it's. I was gonna say, yeah, I had been through Owens Valley and Mammoth Lakes area many times as a kid, but I had never really understood what I was looking at. And as I was a kid, just staring out the car window, everything was just brown and boring. And are we there yet?
Yeah.
But when I was going through the same area with actual teachers who knew what they were looking at and could tell me about it, it changed my whole perspective on everything. And suddenly I was just glued to the window and I was recognizing everything along the way, because I had taken a few classes. And that, that was one of those just empowering moments that drives you forward and makes you want more.
Yeah, that's fair. And that's not something everyone always experiences.
Right. I was pretty lucky to have a family that insisted on getting outside and hiking and adventuring and like fishing and all that stuff pretty frequently. So, I've been training for this job since I was a little kid, is how I look at it.
It's a good way of looking at it too, because it is where your interest came from. Is from childhood. Generally, like, you grow up into something that you want to do for the rest of your life.
Well,
ideally.
my first geoscience teacher really was probably my uncle, because he, more than anybody else, he took me around like the deserts, southern desert of Idaho, the mountains, and we would go fishing and boating, like floating down the Snake River in the boat we built together, and just floating down the Snake River with a beer in our hands and a fishing rod, off the side, getting off getting off on some random shore and then looking at these giant boulders of basalt that have ancient Native American pictographs carved in them. And then going through lava tubes, hiking up over mountains into mountain alpine lakes, and getting lost in the woods and discovering all sorts of creatures out there all the time. It was, I had a lucky childhood, but I wouldn't change any of that because it's, made me who I am.
Well, and are there any places from that you'd like to return to eventually?
Oh yeah. I mean, I frequently visit family in Idaho, and there's lots to do up there as far as adventuring goes. But I think most people would, raise their eyebrow at this one. But I think one of my ideal spots I want to live be probably Bishop, California.
Yeah.
That's, way up there in Owens Valley. Not quite Mammoth, but still got. it's a decent sized town, but there's plenty of nature around you and just breathtaking views.
Very true. I could see that being a good area to rest your campsite for a week or two.
But honestly, I like to get out and go where, I mean, sometimes during the summer, I'll get in my car and just start driving out, go on a spontaneous road trip and end up somewhere and then come back.
Nothing wrong with that. Speaking of trips, how was your experience in Death Valley and Yosemite? Were those two places extreme?
Actually, they were quite perfect because we went at the perfect time of the year for each. Yosemite was the fall trip. We went like middle October, I think. And so yeah, it was not too cold and not too hot, and everything was green and water was flowing, and it was just gorgeous. Yeah, and then we went over the Tioga Pass there, down into Lee Vining next to Mono Lake, and cruised around and looked at the Tufa Towers. I should mention the best, maybe, one of the best parts of these field trips is not just the sights, but the people you meet and like end up making friends with most of the time. Because you're out there for 5 days, camping basically, and you either get along with them or you're gonna have a bad time.
Yeah,
That's how I look at
it's
it.
close quarters.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good to maintain positive relationships.
And in my experience, people who want to go do things like that are usually fairly interesting people. Anyway,
It's true. Yeah, I'd say in most cases that is a very true factor.
so my experience in these places was wonderful. Death Valley was also, it was right after a lot of rain had fallen in Death Valley, and the whole valley was covered in wildflowers. Now, I mean, they're not big, huge flowers that are blanketing the ground. They were tiny little things that you could sometimes barely see. But, once your eyes adjusted to the landscape, you noticed, oh, wow, there's colors everywhere.
Wow, so it's just a whole blanket layer of flowers on the whole like surface.
No, I'm saying it was, it wasn't like a field of flowers like you see in Europe or something. It was more like,
Just little patches.
no, more like tiny individual flowers spaced apart. But, once you look across the landscape and notice these things, you see them everywhere. And it's almost like a magic eye picture.
Yeah. That makes more sense, though. That paints a good picture visually, I think, especially for viewers.
And then, Death Valley is famous for its pretty crazy, interesting geologic wonders, like, Natural Arch Bridge, Mosaic Canyon, the salt pinnacle things. I don't know the name of them. And of course, the famous racetrack. Who can forget?
Yes.
Where the boulders are moving across the dry lake bed, which was a huge mystery for a long time, but we finally figured it out.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild area,
Mm-hmm.
especially just the fact that it's under sea level in some places.
If you're curious, it's definitely worth checking out the story for how they figured it out, what's causing it.
Do you have any good recommendations for article on that?
Just do a Google search. Death Valley racetrack solved. I'm sure you'll find something.
Perfect.
A video. YouTube. I think I saw a YouTube video on it.
Yeah, You know how YouTube is these days. There's information on almost every field imaginable. There's so much media out there. But with that, was your experience as a paleontologic uh, paleontological, field monitor something you enjoyed?
Yeah, I did. The standing around in construction sites for hours on end, staring at the ground part wasn't particularly fun, but um, certain assignments were more fun than others. My favorite was when I got assigned to the Elk Hills. They were going to build some new pipelines, which was the Elk Hills is the southern Central Valley is like big oil reserve area.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, so yeah, I was driving around there with my old '89 Dodge pickup truck, getting stuck in the sand and taking notes on the rocks and finding bones in the rock walls, and I was cruising around with this other interesting dude who's I can't remember his name, but he was the most detailed note taker I have ever seen. To the point where the company kept saying, "Stop writing so many details. We don't need it." I thought that was funny.
That is pretty funny.
But yeah, it was just yet another adventure for me out there.
Well, and for the viewers that don't know what that job entails, what's an aspect that made that work interesting or unique?
Well, in that particular area, it was interesting because I got to drive around and check out different sites. Most assignments, you're kind of standing in a flattened out, construction area, or they're still moving dirt, but your job is basically to stand there with a notebook and just watch for any bones or other types of fossils being dug up, and then if you see something, you say stop, stop digging. I need to note this, and then you note it down and take the fossil back to your truck or throw it in the trash if it's stupid. Or, I mean, not stupid, but if it sucks, it's worthless. Which there's actually quite a few useless fossils you find out there, but yeah. So once you stash the bone, you say, all right, keep digging, and back to work.
It's just a constant repeating cycle.
I mean, it gets exciting when you do find something interesting. Like one of the teams found a 100,000-year-old baby woolly mammoth buried in old river sediment in Fresno. And,
Absolutely cool.
Yeah, I don't remember the company, the client that we were working for, but yeah, the way that works is if we find something big like that, we will dig like around the fossil and then plaster cast the big dirt ball and then throw that in the truck and take that back to the lab and then dig it out very carefully, grain by grain, essentially with tweezers.
So it's just such a precarious process, I'm sure.
Yeah, because these bones especially were like nearly pulverized. They were just falling apart into dust as soon as you touch them. So back in the lab, we have special chemicals that we mix together that we pour into the bone that stabilizes it and kind of makes it glossy, look neat.
You're able to kind of like pull it out more.
Yeah, you're able to keep it intact while you're removing the sand grains from the bone. Okay. And that's really what we're doing. We're not digging it out. We're removing sand grains, essentially, with tweezers.
Gotcha.
It's fun. Honestly, most of my time with that internship was like 90% of my time was spent in the lab with boxes and boxes of little fossils of basically leaf impressions that they found in some places along the 5 freeway in Central Valley area. And so, it was all just leaves and no bones, no creatures. And I don't really know botany very well, so I didn't really know what I was. To me, it was just things to number and organize for hours. But, somebody's got to do the grunt work, and that's what the interns are for.
Yeah, I can testify as a bead sorter at a point that the small little detailed things sometimes can be the worst.
Yep.
Just because of how time consuming each of those things can take.
But it was a nice job because the lab, quote unquote, was technically just the boss's garage.
Oh.
And he lived in a pretty nice place up in Auburn, California. So
very nice area.
Out in the woods. So it was kind of foresty, quiet, and smelled nice.
Yeah, yeah. The smell of the nature is always enjoyable in my eyes.
But honestly, I don't know if that job is not for everybody. It's kind of a niche thing. So, if you're going into geology, might look into getting an internship at a paleo resource consulting firm, which is what I was working for. But it's a decent. It was definitely a decent internship. I had fun. So if you're into that kind of thing, definitely go for it.
Well, with your other one, your work is a mud logger. Is there anything that that kind of work tends to be like unknown? Like what exactly is a mud logger?
So that was my first real job once I graduated with my BS from Sacramento State. And even though I said I wasn't going to go work in the oil field, that was kind of the main people who were hiring at the time. So, gotta eat, gotta put gas in the car. But it was also it was a good experience. It was intense. But I learned a lot about myself through that job. So your question was, is there anything dangerous about that job? Well, yeah, because you're on a giant West Texas oil rig or drilling rig. You got giant pipes being wrangled into place, and you've got gas, natural gas and other types of gas coming out of the well that you got to keep in check. That's part of my job, monitoring those gas levels and radioing the company man if things get too high. But then my main job was they call me a mud logger. Technically, it's a surface logging specialist, but they call me a mud logger because my job was to go out to what they call the shakers, which is where the rock cuttings are being dumped out, and then the drilling mud is washing through the screen and recycling, but the rock cuttings get dumped out. And I collect samples every so often as the drill goes from those shakers. But those rocks are covered in drilling mud, so I take it back to the lab trailer. And I gotta wash it out with. Actually, we use Dawn soap most of the time to wash out the oil.
No kidding.
Yeah, seriously, it kind of does the best job.
I believe it though.
Gave me a whole new appreciation for that stuff.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
Soap's powerful stuff.
But yeah, so then I would wash the rock and kind of crush it up a little more if I needed to. Slide it under a dissecting microscope, not a full petrographic microscope, but enough to see the little pieces of rock and be able to tell what it's made out of. And that was my next job, was describing the minerals found in it, the type of rock the drill was in at the time. And then that goes on the log.
Sure.
Along with gas levels.
You did a lot of observation reports, basically.
Yeah, essentially. There was one rig I got to do some interpretation. That was in Oklahoma. It was basically a mom and pop operation. Interesting. These two old like amateur geologist types were super interested. They took me and my other lab partner out to dinner before the week got started, and we're like, this never happens, but cool. Yeah, so it's all just most of the job is just taking data and trying to stay awake for 24 hours at a time or 12 hours at a time, 84-hour weeks.
Yeah, not everyone can do that.
No.
Some people would crash out right away. Couldn't even last 4.
It's difficult, but your body does adjust to it eventually. And I learned how to operate without much sleep.
Yeah. I'm sure that changed you. Your appreciation for sleep and both how your body handles stress.
Yeah, actually, that experience taught me that I don't really need as much sleep as I thought I used to think.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt that at all.
But then again, you kind of tend to need less sleep as you get older too.
Really? Well, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Brain development and just thyroid health or function in general. But
some people do.
Yeah, it always varies. Moving forward, how was your experience being president of the geology club?
It was interesting, to say the least. It was also a good experience for me. It taught me some much needed interpersonal skills.
Where was this club?
This was at Sacramento State.
Okay.
So, yeah. And this was around 2007. So our geology club wasn't so typical for university clubs in that we were a heck of a lot more active than most of them, for one thing. But we also just made every student in the department a member by default.
Okay.
And so that way, when we needed to get something done, we basically, called in the cavalry or called in the troops. And, for most things, we didn't really need that many people, but we did have a major event every year called the Rock Auction that is a rather big thing to put on, actually, because we had to rent out a whole, big ballroom thing, get the whole auction. We had a live auction and a whole bunch of silent auction tables all around the room, and like a games table and other souvenirs. And so, yeah, it was a big thing. And yeah, we ended up making, I think, over 10 grand that night just by selling rocks and fossils that other people had donated to us. But that was the other big part of the job, was recruiting people to make calls to like everybody that the university knew, plus all of our friends, and begged them for rocks.
Wild stuff.
Yeah, but it worked. But then the rest of the managing the club was putting on other events. Like we had each semester we had a bowling tournament with usually the engineers, but sometimes the biologists wanted in on it. And we had a big stuffed rooster that would get passed around as the trophy.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Sounds like you guys had quite the experience together as a group.
We held it for most years, but then I think the engineers won once, and then biology won. And sorry, what was your question?
Oh, I just was commenting on your group's dynamic. Like, it seems like it was a fun dynamic between you guys.
Yeah, and that was the great thing about the whole thing was the bonds we made as officers, but also as students. But geology is kind of unique, and I think biology is really kind of the only other science that tends to get out there and do things outside. Maybe not the only other one, but out in nature. Geologists, at least in my experience, have a certain there's a geologist type, and there's a variety of people that fit the type, but there's certainly a type. And I don't know, every year I was at that school, I felt like I was just hanging out with my friends and just talking about cool, interesting things all the time. And it really was an amazing space and time for me.
So would you almost say that college helped open your eyes up to networking better?
Yeah, well, I would say that that skill is still developing. I think it always will be, but I didn't really start to feel comfortable with that until after I finished my after I going through my teaching stuff, about halfway through it, I'd say. Once I got in front of the classroom enough times, all that just kind of washes away.
Yeah, eventually you break the habits of social anxiety, I'm sure.
And now I can do it much more easily. I'm no longer afraid to just send an email to somebody and say, "Hey, can you tell me about this?"
Yeah, no kidding. What's the biggest thing you learned from your time as president with the club?
When you put yourself in a leadership position, you gotta, make sure you stay on the ball, because you got a lot of people relying on you for things to happen. Because that auction was a fundraiser for the whole department, but especially the students, because I mentioned the field trips at the community college, but the university was really where field trips were taken to the next level, like exponentially, because almost every one of my geology classes had a field component to it, and that included, like, most of the time at least 2 classes a semester. So I was pretty much out in the field in the Sierras and the Owens Valley and other places every other weekend for a few years, seemed, anyway. But those field trips, where we go and make maps and camp for a week, and all that costs a lot of money. And so that's why we need to raise so much, because that gets distributed out to the students to help them pay for, like, field supplies and other stuff. And we made enough that year to subsidize every student to the point where they didn't have to pay for anything on the field trips, like including food.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So most of these events proved to be successful.
Yeah. But like I said, they were a lot of work, and if you don't stay on it, it could easily not happen. So,
Yeah. Yeah. You lose morale, and then boom, you have 20 people show up. Sure.
and, officer drama is never fun, but it happens once in a while.
Well, in light of that, excuse me, if you could go back and change majors, would you?
Absolutely not. No. Everything I've experienced and done has made me who I am today, and as many problems as I have, and I like who I am and where I am. I wouldn't want to change anything.
That's a good place to be. It's a healthy place to be, both with yourself and with your passions.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, it takes them their whole college career to understand that, and perhaps it's taken you that long. I don't know.
Well, so many people don't get so lucky as to understand what they, like to do from such an early age. Like, you know, uh, I hesitate to share this one, but I actually wrote a song when I was 6 years old about how I wanted to be a paleontologist when I grew up.
It's awesome. I mean,
So,
hey, the things we do when we're young, when we have passions, and you're kind of naive to the facts of what goes on, and kind of the work and the time that goes into different things. Like, it's just an idea. It's a dream at that stage, and you're just excited to have that dream. Like,
well, I did at some point have a job where I had a business card that said paleontologist on it. So check that box.
you check that box. There you go. Then you can say that with confidence to your younger self that you accomplished that dream.
Yep.
Which is a really cool thing. I have to add, and I give you props for that, man. You have to have a lot of grit to get through that much class work and school work, and just the collaboration alone, I'm sure, pushed your buttons some days.
You mean with the club?
Like, well, with just education in general, getting to that point where you're able to present yourself as
Yeah.
part of the club. And
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, yeah. By pushing buttons, you mean that is a good thing.
yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Like, I'm just saying the stress of having to collaborate and work with other people and workshops and different college events. Like, for a lot of people, that creates a lot of anxiety and
Oh,
turmoil.
yeah. It certainly does, and I'm, still no stranger to it. You never really fully get rid of it, but I think the best you can do is learn how to handle it better.
Very valid advice. And with that, are there aspects of the college that made you appreciate the science more than before you studied?
Yeah, the number one thing that pushed me to want to learn more, I'd say, is being surrounded by other interested, enthusiastic people.
Sure. I could see how that could be one of the valuable things.
But also, I had, well, at that school anyway, it really was it's a little state school that's not particularly well known to most people. But as far as that department goes, and well, yeah, that's at least when I was there, it was fantastic. Amazing professors, like they knew their stuff. They were always fun to talk with. I go out camping and adventuring with them any day because I want to hear more about their old times. So
Have you guys been able to reconnect?
Actually, yeah. One of my old professors is a consultant on my current paper I'm trying to get published. So that's
How neat. Yeah, yeah. No kidding. It's always good to be able to get others' opinions, especially on projects.
yeah. It was pretty cool to see his face light up when he when I told him I was working for JPL doing a Mars geology project.
How cool. In speaking of, is there any aspects of that that you'd like to touch on? Because I know that's something you've been working on in recent developments.
Well, sure, but what do you want to know specifically?
Like generally, what got you into being part of that project to begin with? What led you to that opportunity?
It's a little bit of a winding story, but you already know the first half of it. So after the oil field, basically back in 2015 and into 16, OPEC dropped the oil prices, and so it just wasn't worth drilling out in West Texas for a while, and so pretty much everybody got laid off. It was actually pretty amazing to watch. It happened over the course of a year. Just drill what a landscape that used to be just covered in drilling rigs, just slowly, one by one, they just got shuttered up. But
Just with the recession and
yeah. But anyway, so yeah, I got laid off and then had to come back, or I came back to California and had to find something else to do. So I come from a big family of teachers on my mom's side. Yeah, pretty much everybody in that family is a teacher, and including my cousin. And you're not going to get rich by teaching, but it certainly has made a good living for all of us.
sure,
So
sure, and that's something to get passionate with.
and I know a lot about geoscience now, so I figured it would be good to go into and try my hand at. So yeah, I went into the teaching credential program for geoscience, or just general science, Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, so I could teach high school or junior high, and I ended up teaching mostly junior high, Santa Maria, kind of out in the boonies. So it was a little bit isolated, a little bit rough, but they're good kids coming from hard home lives, and there were some really impressive kids there, honestly.
Just super talented or
Yeah.
skilled with what they were doing, like mathematic wise, or
Well, talented and interested and enthusiastic. I think I would say interested and enthusiastic and willing to try are the three top traits to get you through school or even a new job or whatever. If you can show those traits to your boss or your colleagues or your teachers, then you're going to go far. But sorry,
yeah.
I think I dropped answering the question in the middle of it. Where was I?
Hey, no, it's perfectly fine. It was kind of explaining how like the steps that got you to working on that Mars project.
Oh yeah. So I was teaching credential program, teaching middle school for daytime for the job during the year. But in the meantime, I also signed up for a internship program called STAR, and that whole thing is its job is to take new teachers going in to teach science, and put them in one of the national labs for the summer and have them do a project with one of the scientists there, and get some real world science experience and make a poster and write up a thing and act like a real scientist for a while. Then bring that experience back to the classroom, and so that way you could actually convey a little bit better what it is scientists actually do.
How neat, actually, that they have a program like that.
Yeah, it was really cool, actually. So the way it works is, you give them your resume, and then you fill out a questionnaire where they ask you, like, what are your skills? What are your talents? What do you want to do? What do you like to do? And blah, blah, blah. And then they aggregate all that and send them off to the labs. And, the liaisons there, or the people, coordinators, I guess they call them, would read the resumes and say, okay, this scientist would be good with this guy because their skills match up, or this girl could work over here in the biology department. Or the scientists themselves, actually, in the case of the second job, called me straight up and said, you're hired. But anyway, as my first placement was at the National Center for Atmospheric Research for my first summer, and that's in Boulder, Colorado. Luckily, I know an old family friend from Idaho who had moved there, so I was able to stay with them for the summer, and it's a beautiful place. And through that experience, I met some really cool people. It was in the cubicles next door, and we ended up bonding pretty well over the summer, and went through the whole Rocky Mountain National Park and down to Evans Peak together, and did like a 3-day camping trip. And we'd come back to the lab and chat and share our progress on our work and say, oh, that's cool. What is that? And that's interesting. Even though my project there was really just filtering bad data out of years worth of temperature readings, so not too exciting. But I was writing a Perl script to do that, so that was the experience I was getting, was how to code a little bit, and which is good because the last time I had touched any code was back in high school, and I sucked at it. So
coding it's one of those things, like, I've learned over a little time that you use it or you lose it. You really do.
Well, thankfully, I had remembered just enough to be able to, pick up and be able to move forward with it.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, when I first got to the lab, I had driven all the way out to Colorado because I just didn't feel like flying, and I had a car that I was in love with at the time, especially for that kind of environment. And I just wanted a car to be able to drive around Boulder or Colorado in the summer.
Well, now you got to tell us what this car is.
It was a Subaru Baja turbo stick shift.
We're not sponsored by Subaru, I promise.
No. I'll tell you, it was a money pit, but it was easily the most fun car I've ever had. Well, no, maybe not easily. Anyway, okay, enough about the car.
Gotta love cars, so.
Yeah, I do. But where was I? I was saying...
you were explaining you were driving in Colorado, I believe.
Or
you went to Colorado in this car.
Yeah, but I had a point to that. trying to remember what it was. What was like? Why did I bring up the car?
Because it was you didn't want to fly wherever you were going.
Oh yeah, so I was able to stay with a friend over the summer, so I didn't have to pay for housing. But it also, it allowed me to have a pretty relaxing time there, actually. Being able to go out and visit with people and see the sights and visit the town. But yeah, I'd say we had to work on a collaborative project at some point during the summer, and that was fun. But yeah, the collaborative times, I'd say, were the most fun parts for me, and those experiences really showed me that that's where I thrive, is in collaborative projects. As long as everybody else is into the job too. It's easy to get a team member that drops the ball, but when you get a good team, you got a good team. So then, yeah, my second placement, second summer, was at Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, and I was able to stay with another friend there, so didn't have to pay for housing. But I did have to commute on the 210 for quite a while every morning, but thankfully that's like the least worst freeway in LA. But yeah, it's essentially the boss, the planetary science geologist guy at JPL, saw my resume and saw that I had quite a lot of mapping experience that I got through school, geologic mapping experience. And I had a little bit of GIS training like years ago in the old versions, but I also was, both on the resume and on the phone, quite confident in my ability to learn new software quickly, which is true. I definitely consider that a strength. But he just saw my resume, my skills, my background, and kind of he looked at the types of adventures I had specifically and said, "This is the right kind of guy for this job." And so, yeah, I keep getting lucky somehow.
Yeah, you were straight up hand selected.
Right. And
which is
so,
super cool.
yeah, so I made the map over the summer, and it was difficult. I had to learn a lot in a short amount of time. Honestly, I'm not sure I could have done it without my other intern colleague sitting next to me in the lab, because that guy was just he's one of those super people that
It's really gifted at academics.
Yeah, but also parsing a lot of information quickly, and he is easily the fastest typer I've ever seen.
Damn.
By far. And so, yeah, that was a partnership made in heaven. He ended up being my co-author on the paper I wrote about the map second summer. So, yeah, second summer happened to be during COVID, and so pretty much every day two of us were on Discord together, just mapping and writing and trading figures and going, what do you think of this? No, it needs that.
Yeah, just kind of generally discussing what's going on your project.
And meanwhile, sharing our love of various other science things. And, we just meshed really well. And I miss that. I wish I could have a good partner like that for my thesis.
I'm sure it would make the project a lot more enjoyable.
Enjoyable, but also just better quality, because that's what I've learned, at least with my collaborations, is the more minds on a project typically ends up with better results.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I would agree. In most cases, you always, I'd say, yeah, like almost all
Honestly,
cases.
that's also why every time I go out to the field to map, I want a partner there to fight with me about what I see and what I think I'm doing on my map.
Yeah,
Because if somebody else isn't there to reality check me once in a while, sometimes you make silly mistakes.
absolutely. Yeah, that's a human condition. We're only
And
conditioned to see what's around us and feel what we feel.
I consider myself a good field mapper, but nobody's perfect.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure in that field you have to expect failures.
Well, that's also why I like the field. It's kind of fuzzy by default or by nature.
Yeah, there's no normal.
or there's no like set scale for anything. The more you zoom in, the more details there are.
Sure.
At any level.
Well, and with that, I actually have a question personally. What
Mm-hmm.
helped you through college and academics? What's one aspect that helped you keep up that would help the struggling student?
Well, not being tested for ADHD until last year was certainly not one of them. But I'd say the things that did help me get through are like I said before, my interest, enthusiasm, and what was the other one? It was interest, enthusiasm, and it's a variety of things. I couldn't also throw in willingness to collaborate. Definitely helped me because it wasn't just with big projects. I liked to collaborate on just basic homework assignments too, even if it's just comparing answers and saying, okay, I missed that detail.
Sure. Reflection is one thing that I have to vouch for personally.
Yeah.
I think reflection is very underrated when it comes to sharing it with other people. I think every class could benefit from peer collaboration on that extent because it both expresses a personal connection to the academics and the study itself, and it broadens your horizon on what people are thinking, what kind of processes are going through their head, especially with something like science where a lot of it's observation based. Being able to present information clearly is half the challenge, I'd imagine.
Well, geology is not just observation. It's observation, and then critically, the next part is interpretation, which there comes the fuzzy part.
Yes, that when I took geology, that was a big factor. That I forgot to mention. That is
actually, now that I'm getting a master's degree in geography, which is related but not quite the same. But I still we still deal with maps and everything. Most of the map stuff that geology uses came from cartography stuff, so there's a lot of overlap. But now that I one of the things I learned through my coursework here is this concept called the modifiable areal unit problem in geography, which essentially means what I said before. The further you zoom in, the more details there are, and the further you zoom out, the fuzzier it gets. But essentially what that means is there's no think of it like this. Where exactly is the boundary between a mountain and the plains?
I would say the boundary is generally what percentage of change starts to occur.
Yeah. See,
Like an average.
sure. I mean, sure, why not? But honestly, that's just an arbitrary number that you picked. So
That's true. Yeah, I see your point in that example. That's a perfect analogy, actually.
yeah.
Um,
So, I mean, even that's why computers have such a hard time with mapping things, because
the
unless
density
there's
levels.
discrete boundaries between objects, it's really difficult for the computer to discern like types of terrain.
Yeah, we live in an obscure universe. Things are a little bit abstract.
Although we, thankfully, we're much better at figuring out like living things from space, but that's because they all have very specific spectral signatures most of the time. Rocks do
Yeah,
too, but they're much more difficult to discern.
yeah, I'd imagine, and I'm sure looking at the geological patterns on Mars is a little bit trippy compared to what you're used to seeing in the day
It
to
is.
day.
It really is. I mean, we tend to call Mars the yes but planet, referring to how we like to compare everything on Mars to Earth, and we say, yeah, it's like that thing on Earth, but not because of this.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I hope you can come back on the podcast at a point and we can discuss more about kind of interstellar. I don't know if that's the
Uh,
correct form of term, but
Interplanetary or planetary science is
planetary science. That would make more sense than interstellar.
I would say my thesis is a combination of tectonics, geomorphology, and it's just straight up geology.
Really cool. I admire that you've taken the time to put dedication into the study because this is something that's going to help future generations understand what's below us, what's around us. I have a deep respect for this field of study and interest personally. I love rocks. I love the formations of our planet and being able to discuss this kind of stuff is just it's a treat, and I appreciate you being able to share this today.
You're welcome.
Um,
And it's been a pleasure to be on, and I'll come back anytime you want to have me.
awesome. I want to just close with two more questions for you. Is there anything you would like to recommend to our viewers? Any books, shows, podcasts that speak to you? Kind of
Yeah,
helped.
absolutely. Um, believe it or not, it's not going to be a geology book. Actually, one of the books, most influential books I've read. Well, I'll recommend a couple. The first one is Our Inner Ape by Franz de Waal, who's a primatologist who studies chimpanzees and bonobos. And the book is essentially a pontific or yeah, a thoughtful examination of chimpanzees and bonobos, comparing their traits and behaviors, and essentially discovering that you put our two closest genetic relatives together and you end up with humans, essentially.
Whoa. And it's like the whole is it essentially his theory of how the science
No,
behind it, or is it actually
no,
analyzing and cross-referencing?
no, it's so I want to be clear. He's not suggesting that humans evolved from these two species. No, they are our cousins from a common ancestor with us. But what I'm saying is, yeah, the book is essentially he brings up a bunch of examples of chimpanzee behavior, and then bonobo behavior by contrast, and then there's a whole philosophical discussion about the two versus each other, and then eventually humans. So it's definitely worth a look.
Interesting. Yeah, that sounds cool. It's like showing similarities in the patterns of guessing.
And then another book I would highly recommend is Your Inner Fish.
Inner Fish, huh?
Not by the same author. This one is by I'm blanking on the name, but it's a unique enough title. You'll find it. Yeah, so Your Inner Fish, and it's essentially a sort of a narrative way to convey the 3.5 billion year history of the human body, basically how we got from fish to what we are now.
So it's basically the biological roadmap.
And it answers a lot of questions like, why do humans have such bad knees, and why do we get hiccups? So and a lot of that is just because as our bodies changed and developed, things just got warped and misplaced and moved around and broken. But it's an interesting story to see like how all that happened over time. And then finally, the last book I'll recommend is probably one of my favorite books from my teenage years, called Snow Crash by Neil Stevenson. And it is one of the earlier and probably one of the bigger influences on the cyberpunk game. It's a cyberpunk story. It's pretty good.
That's awesome. And that's a fantasy book?
Yeah, cyberpunk, sci-fi, fantasy.
That's awesome.
It's basically, kind of near-ish future, techno Babylon, essentially, California.
I love that you threw that in.
Mm-hmm.
You got all these deep, introspective books about development.
Oh, yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, because it does involve, the plot line does involve the development of the human brain.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's really neat. I'll have to check that one out.
Good.
Get my cousin on that. He might like that one. Are there any closing thoughts you have for the audience? Any advice?
Be interested in things, try new things, have an open mind, say yes more than you say no, because that will lead you through way more doors than the other way.
Very well said. And with that, I appreciate you coming on tonight, John. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
And again, we hope to have you on in the future. Get more into these discussions deeper. And
I can talk about Mars for days.
Oh, I know you can. I'm excited to get into those discussions too.
All right.
Once we get Paul on the podcast, he's going to be co-hosting with us soon.
Cool.
We'll have some good talks there.
Awesome. All right. I'll see you next time.
Hey, it's been a pleasure. And thank you so much for joining us today on the World Networking Podcast. We're going to have another guest in the next 2 weeks join us, and we hope that you can stop by and tune in. Until next time, my friends, you take care.